I just made it to a slum in Bulgaria where more than 70,000 gypsies call home.
Merhaba abi, nasılsın?
Salam.
Merhaba.
What country are we in? This is crazy. Gypsies, or Romani people, are a nomadic ethnic group who can trace their roots back to northern India.
I spent a day in Europe's largest gypsy slum. The first thing that made me question everything I thought I knew about Stolipinovo was not poverty. They were luxury cars. I was standing in one of the most deprived neighborhoods I had ever visited, surrounded by crumbling apartment blocks, overflowing rubbish, broken roads, and buildings that looked as though they had been neglected for decades. Then a polished Mercedes rolled past me, followed by another expensive car. I noticed gold jewelry, expensive clothing, and people carrying themselves with an obvious sense of pride. It didn't fit the picture I had expected, and that was only the beginning. If you enjoy travel stories that challenge the assumptions we make about places and people, subscribe, because what I discovered during one day in Stolipinovo was far more complicated than the image I had arrived with. Stolipinovo is a large neighborhood in Plovdiv, Bulgaria, widely described as one of Europe's largest Roma settlements. Before arriving, I had seen photographs and reports about poverty, discrimination, overcrowding, unemployment, and social exclusion. I expected hardship. What I didn't expect was how quickly the simple story of rich versus poor would fall apart. As I entered the neighborhood, the physical conditions were impossible to ignore. Some apartment buildings were severely deteriorated. Parts of the streets were covered with rubbish. Infrastructure appeared badly maintained, and some families were living in conditions that would be difficult for anyone to accept. But there was something else happening at the same time. People were going about ordinary life. Children moved through the streets. Families gathered together. Shops operated. People visited one another. Cars came and went. There was an unmistakable sense that this wasn't simply a place of poverty. It was home. That distinction became important to me because I realized I had arrived carrying a picture of Stolipinovo that had been created almost entirely from the outside. Then I began noticing the ethnic and linguistic divisions inside the neighborhood. I had initially thought of the entire community as one group. It wasn't that simple. Roma and Turkish communities live alongside one another with differences in language, identity, family traditions, and social networks. Some residents communicate primarily in Romani, others in Turkish or Bulgarian, and many navigate between several languages depending on the situation. That was my first major correction. I had come expecting one community with one identity. Instead, I found layers of identity sitting on top of each other. And then came the detail that completely challenged the stereotype I had formed. The expensive cars weren't an illusion. Neither was the gold. Some residents who lived in visibly poor surroundings displayed signs of wealth that seemed completely contradictory to their environment. At first, I couldn't understand it. How could somebody live near deteriorating buildings and streets filled with rubbish while owning an expensive vehicle or wearing substantial gold jewelry? But the contradiction was only there if I assumed that a neighborhood's physical condition perfectly represented the financial situation of every individual living inside it. It doesn't. A person can have money while the infrastructure around them remains poor. A family can prioritize a car, jewelry, weddings, or other visible symbols of status while living in an environment affected by long-term deprivation. And that realization forced me to reconsider something else. Poverty is not always as visually simple as outsiders imagine. Some families were clearly struggling severely. Others appeared to have considerably more financial resources. The neighborhood contained both realities at the same time. But underneath all of this was a deeper problem: education. For many children, the path through school is not guaranteed. Poverty, discrimination, family circumstances, and social exclusion can make education difficult to complete. The consequences can follow someone for years, limiting employment opportunities and reinforcing the same cycle their parents experienced. I also encountered discussions around early marriage and traditional expectations surrounding family life. These subjects are complicated because it is easy for an outsider to look at one tradition and immediately judge an entire community by it. I had to remind myself that I was seeing individual families and individual choices, not a single rule followed by everyone. At the same time, pretending that difficult practices do not exist would be just as misleading. There are genuine social problems here. There are children whose opportunities can be limited before they are old enough to understand why. There are families dealing with unemployment and exclusion. There are serious concerns surrounding drugs in parts of the neighborhood. And there is a long history of discrimination against Roma people that cannot simply be separated from present-day conditions. That history changed the way I interpreted what I was seeing. When an entire community experiences discrimination over generations, poverty isn't simply a matter of individual choices, but that still wasn't the whole story. What surprised me most was how strongly community and family remained visible despite the hardship. I saw people maintaining relationships, gathering together, preparing for celebrations, and taking pride in traditions that connected them to their families and identity. Weddings were particularly revealing. They could become enormous expressions of family pride, with elaborate clothing, jewelry, music, cars, and celebrations. From the outside, it might seem strange to see such displays of wealth in a neighborhood where some buildings were falling apart. But again, I was making the mistake of measuring people's priorities through my own expectations. For some families, a wedding isn't simply an expense. It's a public expression of family, status, belonging, and tradition. The more I observed, the less comfortable I became with the easy descriptions I had carried into the neighborhood. I had expected to find victims of poverty. Instead, I found people trying to live normal lives inside an environment shaped by extraordinary disadvantages. I had expected one culture. Instead, I found multiple identities overlapping. I had expected everyone to be poor. Instead, I saw a complicated mixture of hardship, ambition, pride, and visible wealth. And I had expected the biggest challenge to be understanding the neighborhood. It turned out to be understanding my own assumptions. There was another uncomfortable reality I couldn't ignore. Some residents described experiences of discrimination and exclusion that affected how they interacted with the wider society. For people living outside the neighborhood, it can be easy to see Stolipinovo as a separate world and then blame the people inside it for the separation. But isolation can become self-reinforcing. Poor infrastructure contributes to isolation. Limited educational opportunities contribute to isolation. Discrimination contributes to isolation. Unemployment contributes to isolation. Then outsiders see the consequences and use them as evidence that the community itself is the problem. That cycle is much harder to break than a single road, building, or policy. By the end of the day, I had stopped trying to decide whether Stolipinovo was poor or wealthy. It was both, depending on who I was looking at. It was traditional and modern, Roma and Turkish, proud and struggling, connected internally while often feeling disconnected from the society surrounding it. And perhaps most importantly, it was human. One of the last things that stayed with me wasn't a broken building or an expensive car. It was hospitality. Despite everything I had seen and everything I had heard about the difficulties people faced, I encountered warmth and generosity that I hadn't expected. That moment made the entire experience more uncomfortable in a different way. Because it is easy to look at a place from a distance and reduce it to statistics. Poverty, crime, drugs, education, discrimination. But when you spend time around people, those categories become individuals, families, Children, parents, people trying to get through the same ordinary day that everyone else is trying to get through. I left Stolipinovo knowing more than I had when I arrived. But I didn't leave with a simple conclusion. I still had questions. How much of the neighborhood's hardship comes from individual decisions, and how much comes from generations of exclusion? How much could change if children had genuinely equal access to education and opportunity? And how much of what outsiders believe about Stolipinovo comes from reality, compared with stereotypes repeated so many times that they begin to feel like facts? Even the luxury cars had left me with a question. Maybe they weren't evidence that the poverty was exaggerated. Maybe they were evidence that poverty, like people, is complicated. And that is what I remember most from my day there. I arrived expecting to see a forgotten place. Instead, I found a community that had not forgotten itself. I saw hardship, but I also saw pride. I saw exclusion, but I also saw belonging. I saw people struggling with problems that are very real, while refusing to let those problems completely define who they were. I still don't know whether I truly understood Stolipinovo in a single day. Maybe nobody could, and perhaps that is the point. If you were in my position, would the poverty have shaped your impression first, or would the people and their stories have changed it? Tell me what you think in the comments, and subscribe if you want more travel stories that go beyond the version of a place we usually see.